Hello Science 7, exciting video coming for you on YouTube on cell biology. Next Tuesday I think we have a test in this class, and it's going to be on cell biology, how to use the microscope, parts of the cell, etc. And so I thought one way to kind of help this, do a little review here. And so one of the first things we talked about was the cell theory. And it's one of the most fundamental things in biology, besides the idea that things evolve, and also this idea of DNA dogma, that genetic information is in our DNA. In any case, the first part of the cell theory is pretty straightforward, that all life as we know it is made of cells, or as I wrote here, all organisms are composed of similar units of organization called cells. And so either a single-celled organism or multicellular like our cells. We're made of trillions of cells. Second, here are some pictures of critters made of cells. So here animals are made of cells. There's Bambi in there, I think, somewhere. We can also talk about these type of animals, because normally when you think of animals, you think of these mammals back here, but most of life actually in terms of animals actually is these guys, which are arthropods. We also talk about plants, all made out of cells. We can also talk about fungi. I like this one here. They're all made out of cells. And we can also talk about this crazy group called Protista, which are also made out of cells, which could be multicellular green algae, slimy stuff, to paramecium and other types of things. But Protista, or protozoans, is a group of this too. And last but not least, we can also, life is bacteria. And these are all, except those don't look like bacteria, but they're theoretically bacteria. So bacteria. So all things are made of cells. The second part of this is the cell is a structural and functional unit of all living things. What does that mean? Well, if you look at a cell and look at all the parts inside there, whatever you're doing is based on what the cells are doing. So if you're taking in oxygen and giving off carbon dioxide, the cell's doing that for you, as in the mitochondria. If you are moving down the hallway, closing a locker, it's taking muscles. Well, how's that working? Well, it's your muscle cells doing those type of things. So everything you do, all your physiology is all based on what the cells are doing. If you're a plant, same thing. If you're carrying out photosynthesis and you're transporting things through, like we have veins to transport blood, well, plants, at least vascular plants, have veins also to transport water and nutrients back and forth. So, structural unit. Last part of it is pretty straightforward, which is that all life that is made of cells come from pre-existing cells. So how does that work? Well, cells split and divide. Here on the right side you can see a cell that started out as one, now it's two. And here's a really cool technique that's used here to actually show this blue stuff would actually be the genetic material. And these are some of the cytoskeleton moving it along. Cool stuff. And here's yet one more, and this is really cool. Here's a kind of amoeboid type thing splitting up into two. There's a nucleus, and where you have one, now you have two. And of course, we all started out as a single cell, which kept dividing and dividing to make more cells until we are these trillions of cells, which make you. Now here's a tricky one, which was, why are cells so small? Well, when you look at a cell, I don't care what kind of cell it is, you're going to need things in and out of that cell. This around here is kind of the cell membrane. There's a nucleus, of course, but so things that the cell takes in might be oxygen, might need nutrients to get in, but it also has to get rid of things. For example, carbon dioxide and other types of waste, because really carbon dioxide is a type of waste if you think about it. But all these things have to get in and out of the cell. Now the problem is that when cells get really big, something happens. So here's a small cell, bigger and bigger. Well, as the cell gets bigger, clearly the surface area, and the surface area refers to like all the edges that are exposed to the environment, that gets bigger, and also the volume gets bigger too. But the interesting thing about this is that when cells get bigger, the volume increases faster than the surface area. So there's this ratio of surface area to volume. Bottom line, turns out, is that there's a limit to how big a cell can be, because at some point materials just can't get in and out fast enough for the cell. So very rarely do you find a really huge cell, and if you do, it's going to be a very specialized cell, like an egg cell, which eventually divides down to smaller sizes. Or if I mentioned there's a nerve cell, but that nerve cell can survive because it has extra little supplemental cells helping materials enter and leave. So bottom line is, why cells are so small is that when it gets too big, this ratio of surface area to volume is really wacky, and materials just can't enter and leave efficiently. So it almost be like dead spots in there where there's not enough oxygen coming in, or waste can't get out, or nutrients can't get in. So those are the three parts of the cell theory. And here, one more time, and this little slide just shows the math involved. So that if you have like 1 by 1 by 1, clearly the surface area is going to be 6. well, you can take a look at the numbers here, but what happens is that ratio gets really out of whack quickly. Now this was really interesting in here, that here's both these big blocks here have the same volume, but if you split it up into smaller little pieces, even though they have the same volume, this one has infinitely more surface area. And that's a good thing, because remember, you want to be able to let materials get in and out. This also explains why you have lots of folds and nooks and crannies and things. Like when you look at a model of a brain, it's got folds in it, and that creases more surface area. Now, cell types. Well, when you talk about the different types of cells on planet Earth, in other words, all life, it really comes down to two different types of cells. One is prokaryotic, one is eukaryotic. Very small, primitive, and these are much larger, which we're made out of. We'll go through the prokaryotic first. And probably the big thing about prokaryotic cells is they don't have an organized nucleus. So there's no quote-unquote true nucleus. Membrane bound just means that there's like an envelope around it. There's like it's in a baggie. There's some kind of covering around it. Prokaryotic cells do have DNA and genetic information, but they don't have it organized in this membrane-bound organelle. So you're never going to find a nucleus in a prokaryotic cell. Eukaryotic cells do have a membrane-bound organelle. Or nucleus, I should say, which is an organelle, and many others actually. And that's probably one of the major differences between the two. So here's an example of a eukaryotic cell, and here you can actually see a nucleus. But these structures in here, the mitochondria and some of the other structures, they're also membrane bound. But the big key thing is that they do have a nucleus. And here's a plant cell. And a plant cell is also eukaryotic, so it's got this kind of nucleus inside there. And in addition to that, this one has a chloroplast, which is also a membrane-bound organelle, as in that mitochondria there. When we talk about fungi, fungi here is part of like a hyphae, it's called, which is like the root system, which some of the, most all fungi have. And notice here that there's a nucleus again. That's probably a mitochondria. And we'll mention this a little bit later, but there's a cell wall in fungus. And the other group that are eukaryotic happen to be these amoeboid type things. We looked at one of these under the microscope, the slide. This one's kind of cool because it's part plant animal. It's got chloroplast, yet it ingests food. And this would be the eukaryotic cells. Now the other thing about the difference between eukaryotic and prokaryotic, besides just the fact that the prokaryotic do not have a nucleus, is the size range here. That here's a meter, that's a person there, cut off, and down to something called nanometers. So we're focusing on micrometers. Remember, 1,000th of a millimeter. Well, most of plant cells fall in this range of 100 micrometers or less. But when you get down to bacteria, they're much smaller, like 1/100th of it possibly. You can see that here's some bacteria here. And then we get down to viruses, which are even smaller. And then cell organelles and etc. down the line. But so prokaryotic cells much smaller. They do not have a nucleus. Eukaryotic cells are much larger, have a nucleus, and they're a much more evolved type of cell. And the last part of this is about some of the structures and organelles that you find in the cell. And remember, organelles are kind of analogous to like organs in a person. So that if we talk about a liver, heart, muscle, kidney, etc., these are actually organs that we have in our body. Well, in a cell, we have organelles, which kind of form some of the same kind of functions, more or less. But ribosomes, mitochondria, nucleus, Golgi body, etc., ER, all these organelles inside the cell. Okay. First one is the cell membrane. This is one we're going to probably do in the lab very soon. Or actually, we may have done it already by the time you see this, but this happens to be cells from your body, a cheek cell. And here is a cell membrane that surrounds it. Of course, there's a nucleus, so this is a eukaryotic cell. And the cell membrane has several functions, but one of them that we're going to deal with pretty much has to do with it's kind of like the gatekeeper. It regulates what enters and leaves the cell. And just so you actually see what they look like in a little more detail, the bottom one here is electron micrograph. That you'll learn more about this in detail when you're a junior, but the cell membrane is this double layer of lipids, which are fatty things and proteins embedded together. And besides allowing for materials to enter and leave, there's a whole host of other functions that your cell membrane have. Here's another picture of the same type of things to get the idea that it's double membrane bound organelles, because some of these act as receptors for hormones and receptors for neurotransmitters, all kinds of cool stuff, and enzymes embedded in there. But all I want you to know about right now is that it regulates what enters and leaves a cell. And as I wrote here, it's found in all cells. In other words, all eukaryotic and all prokaryotic cells. Now the next structure is the cell wall. And the cell wall is only found in plant, fungi, and the prokaryotic cells. And this should look very similar to what you've seen already. This is actually an onion cell stained with iodine. Here's a nucleus, there's a cytoplasm, this going around here, this kind of rectangular cell here is the cell wall. And the cell wall has pretty straightforward function, that it provides support and protection for the cell. So here's some cartoon pictures, and this is kind of the cell wall around a plant cell of some sort, probably. And click again, and here's yet another picture cartoon of a kind of a plant cell. Notice it's really boxy and square, and how thick this cell wall is. And actually the cell membrane is here, just on the inside of it, but it's very hard to see. They call it the plasma membrane here, but that's a cell membrane. And one thing I'd like you to know about the cell wall in plant cells anyhow is that it's composed of cellulose. Whenever you see ose, as in sucrose, galactose, fructose, lactose, it's a sugar. But this is kind of this is really fiber, so it's really hard. It's kind of what wood's made out of and paper's made out of. Pretty quick one is the nucleus. And whoa, that's wrong. Found only in eukaryotic cells. That's wrong. Have to change that. So this is found only in eukaryotic cells. So I have to go back and change this, but I'm not going to change it on this video right now. Nucleus contains the genetic information, contains the nuclear material. We often call it the control center of the cell. And as I said, just got done saying that it contains the genetic information, which of course is DNA. And here is just a little more detail of a nucleus. This actually is not a cell, this is actually a nucleus. Inside there's a nucleolus, which is actually where ribosomes are made. But this is a really cool picture. This is an electron micrograph showing the envelope or nuclear membrane around here, and there would be the genetic information inside there. We're not going to worry about the nucleolus, but it shows up here in any case. Next one is the mitochondria. And mitochondria are always kind of drawn the same way. They're kind of drawn this like bean-shaped kind of thing with little wiggly, squiggly things in there. And that increases the surface area. Remember I talked about that surface area and folds. It creates more surface area. And the mitochondria are found in all eukaryotic cells. We call it, quote-unquote, the powerhouse of the cell. And the reason we call it the powerhouse of the cell is this is where the cell gets its energy from. So this is where cellular respiration occurs in the cell. Remember, cellular respiration is that process of combining sugar with oxygen, the stuff we're breathing in, and then that should be an arrow there, but it changed to a box. But we end up with carbon dioxide, water that we breathe out. And most importantly, we use this energy to do all the things we do. And again, here's this really cool electron micrograph of what a mitochondria looks like. Now, if you look at the scale down here, just a note of reference, it doesn't say micrometers, but it says nanometers, so they're even smaller than micrometers. So 1 nanometer is equal to 1/1000th of a micrometer. So this is really teeny tiny. You could not see a mitochondria with a light microscope. You have to use electron microscope. So make sure you don't label it in any of your drawings. Chloroplast. Chloroplast, site of photosynthesis. And here's one here, here's one here. And they kind of look similar to kind of almost like a mitochondria type of thing. And like the mitochondria, they're only found in eukaryotic cells. And this is a site of photosynthesis. If you're a producer in your eukaryotic cell, then you have a chloroplast. Remember, you're trapping light energy and spreading energy to the ecosystem. And here is the reaction, almost the opposite, remember, of cellular respiration, which is now we're taking light energy, primarily from the sun, combining it with water and carbon dioxide that just coincidentally we breathe out. And then the plants can then change it back to oxygen and sugar. And then that sugar can be stored and we can use it. So it works out really nice. Ribosomes. Ribosomes are teeny tiny. These little blue dots here would represent the ribosomes. And sometimes they're also associated with this like squiggly thing, this blue thing, the endoplasmic reticulum. Ribosomes have one major function, and that is this is where protein synthesis occurs. So all the proteins which have many, many functions in your body, including enzymes and antibodies and hormones and structural proteins, etc., this is where they're all formed. And this is actually a pretty cool computer rendition of what a ribosome would look like. These little dots here would all represent a little molecule. Actually, all represent amino acids, actually. But all I want you to know is that this is where protein synthesis occurs. Okay, the ER, this is like the big mouthful, endoplasmic reticulum, though I'll be happy you just note it's ER. Well, the ER represented here is this kind of little blue squiggly things, and again, may be associated with ribosomes. Kind of acts as kind of a passageway or delivery system within the cell, so when these proteins are manufactured in the ribosome, they can kind of get transported throughout the cytoplasm, which is kind of nice. They also form a kind of platform or basis for some of these reactions occur to make proteins, and also they make lipid things, which are actually kind of fats. But I think what I wrote here was just that I want them to know that they're where they process and transport chemical compounds, and some of those chemical compounds could be proteins. And here on this little diagram, you can see they're often associated closely with the nucleus, which makes sense because we're making proteins. The information to make proteins are in the DNA. So there's this nice connection between information that's in the nucleus to get out into the cytoplasm in the ER and the ribosomes to make it. So think of it almost like a manufacturing plant. Well, here are the bosses inside, here are the nucleus, all the information. They give the orders to manufacture something, and the information gets sent out of the nucleus out to the manufacturing area, which would be the ribosomes. And the next one is the Golgi complex. And the Golgi complex is kind of interesting one, that after those proteins are manufactured in the ER along with the ribosomes, actually in the ribosomes along with the ER, they modify them and change them and get them ready to be transported out of the cell. So that's what the Golgi complex is all about. And I think that might be it. So that was pretty exciting, I know, and I imagine you just want to watch this 3 or 4 more times.